If you look at most productivity videos online right now, you would think success is entirely about waking up at 4 in the morning, taking a freezing cold ice bath, and grinding relentlessly until midnight. You are constantly told to optimize every single second of your existence. I tried that exact lifestyle. It was absolutely miserable and completely unsustainable. Now my daily routine looks completely different from what the internet productivity gurus passionately preach. In fact, I spend about 80% of my working day doing just one single, highly specific thing. It is not a secret side hustle, it is not a magical cryptocurrency trading algorithm, and it is definitely not going to make you a millionaire by next Tuesday. But adapting this exact philosophy has completely changed how I operate, how I think, and the absolute quality of the professional work I produce. I realized a few years ago that I was spending 80% of my time on things that generated roughly 20% of the actual tangible results. The classic Pareto principle was playing out right in front of my eyes, but I was far too blind to see it. I was desperately trying to do 100 different things at once. I was replying to emails within seconds, constantly scrolling through social media feeds for so-called creative inspiration, joining completely pointless video meetings that could have easily been a brief text message, and jumping erratically from task to task. It was thoroughly exhausting. I was putting all my mental energy into just trying to look busy. Modern corporate society deeply rewards the mere appearance of hard work. We desperately want to be seen typing furiously, running frantically between offices, and managing a chaotic, packed schedule. It makes us feel incredibly important. So I took a massive step back, and I flipped the entire model upside down. I decided to stop performing work and start engineering work. So what exactly is the specific activity that consumes 80% of my working hours today? If you listen to the tech influencers online right now, they will confidently tell you that artificial intelligence and modern automation tools do absolutely everything for you in 5 seconds flat. They boldly sell you this utopian dream where you just type a vague sentence into a chat box, click a shiny, colorful button, and boom! You instantly have a finished product, a comprehensive corporate financial report, or a total masterpiece of digital design. That narrative is a complete and utter myth, or at least it is a massive myth if you want anything that actually looks professional, functions correctly, or provides real tangible value in the highly competitive real world. The brutal, honest truth is, I spend 80% of my day doing something incredibly tedious and unglamorous. I spend it building the logic. Specifically, I spend my time heavily engineering the underlying analytical structures, writing exhaustive prompt architectures, and defining the exact parameters before a single piece of actual work is ever produced by any system. I am not the one blindly swinging the hammer. I am the one spending countless hours meticulously designing the blueprint so that the hammer swings itself perfectly every single time. Let me give you a highly detailed practical example to make this completely concrete. Most people use artificial intelligence tools like a digital slot machine. They pull the lever with a basic prompt and just sit there, hoping for a good result to miraculously appear out of thin air. When the system outputs absolute garbage, which it usually does, when given poor, vague instructions, they get incredibly frustrated. They immediately blame the tool. They complain that the technology is not ready yet, or that it is completely useless for serious professional work. I do not operate like that at all. I spend hours upon hours setting up highly complex frameworks. Let us deeply look at visual design and digital graphic generation first. People often mistakenly think you can just casually ask a system to make a graphic and expect sheer perfection. But when you are aiming for highly specific technical aesthetics, like a modern two-dimensional flat vector infographic, it requires an immense level of spatial and technical precision. The artificial intelligence naturally struggles with rigid spatial awareness if left completely to its own devices. It wants to blend styles, it wants to add unnecessary gradients, and it wants to ignore your basic requests. So instead of rolling the digital dice 100 times and getting increasingly frustrated, I spend 4 straight hours writing out a meticulous JSON configuration file. I do not just ask for a pretty image, I literally define the exact high saturation levels, the specific thickness of the bold, clean lines, the precise hex codes for the entire color palette, the exact spatial layout, and the rigid mathematical constraints the system absolutely must follow. If I am working on complex character design, perhaps aiming for a highly specific classic television animation style reminiscent of Family Guy, I have to manually build intense boundaries to stop the system from hallucinating wild details. Without strict logic systems, these visual tools constantly mess up limb placements, giving characters bizarre distorted hands, physically impossible awkward postures, or completely disjointed facial features. Furthermore, when you urgently need high-resolution upscaling, the system frequently loses the sharp crispness of the original concept and awkwardly adds unwanted messy textures. To actively prevent this disaster, I have to engineer aggressive negative constraints, defining exactly what the system is strictly forbidden from doing under any circumstances. It truly looks like I am doing absolutely nothing productive. If you walked past my desk, you would just see me staring intensely at lines of raw code and text. Tweaking a single word, running a test, watching it fail, analyzing the precise point of failure, and completely rewriting the logic block. It is entirely unglamorous. There is no rapid-fire typing. There is mostly just thinking, pausing, and aggressive, relentless testing. But let us logically pivot away from creative visual design and move deeply into something rigorously analytical like corporate financial analysis and dense office data management. The exact same 80% logic rule applies here with even significantly higher stakes. Suppose I firmly need to deeply interpret complex corporate income statements and extract highly granular financial reporting metrics to accurately determine the true economic health of a massive company. Most average office workers would just lazily dump the raw financial document into a data processor and ask for a quick summary. The result they get back will almost always be shallow, incredibly generic, and often completely mathematically incorrect because the system entirely lacks the necessary accounting context. A single hallucinated number could completely ruin a quarterly presentation. Instead, I spend my 80% physically building a rigorous chain of thought framework. I mathematically force the system to break down its internal reasoning, step by meticulous step. I create a strict logic path that instructs the processor to first painstakingly locate the core revenue streams, then isolate the specific operating expenses, then precisely calculate the exact margins before even attempting to generate a final cohesive summary. I have heavily engineered the prompt to deeply understand the structural nuances of standard accounting tables and to trace exactly where specific figures in a dense financial report originally came from. If a number looks even slightly out of place, the logic system must implicitly know how to accurately trace it back to its absolute source document. This deep, intense preparation extends directly into everyday mundane office productivity. Imagine dealing with massive, sprawling spreadsheets filled with raw, chaotic personnel data. You urgently need to execute incredibly complex seniority-based calculations using precise filtering formulas like SUMIF or SUMIFs. If you attempt to rapidly automate this without building the foundational logic first, you will inevitably get broken formulas, corrupted data, and a massive headache that takes days to manually fix. I spend my time deliberately outlining the exact logical parameters of how the raw data should be aggressively filtered, how the hierarchical formulas must be mathematically structured, and how potential calculation errors should be automatically flagged and handled. This exact same logic building applies when converting massive, dense text documents into cohesive, minimal presentation slides. You cannot just casually ask a machine to make slides. You must rigidly define the hierarchy of headings, the strict maximum word count per slide, and the overarching narrative flow. By the time I actually securely run the system to generate the financial calculations, or to seamlessly convert the Word document into a presentation, the actual execution is completely flawless and takes mere seconds. Now, you might be naturally wondering if this highly rigid logic building only applies to cold, hard mathematics or strictly technical visual design. It absolutely does not. The most incredibly challenging and deeply fascinating part of my day often involves structuring logic for deeply emotional, cultural, or literary analysis. Processing complex human emotional data actually requires the strongest, most rigid logic of all. Let us closely examine a scenario where I am intensely working on drafting a comprehensive proposal for a major reading culture competition. A project deeply aimed at inspiring entire communities and acting as a passionate ambassador for literature. Or perhaps I am deeply analyzing the incredibly nuanced, complex characters found in classic literature. For example, the harrowing and profoundly emotional narratives found in culturally significant works like Tuoi To Dudoi, authored by the legendary Pung Quan. You absolutely cannot rush the analysis of such profound human experiences. If you genuinely want to accurately extract the true thematic essence of these literary characters, their immense personal sacrifices, their raw, unwavering patriotism, and their deeply complex psychological development amidst conflict, you have to diligently build a deeply empathetic, yet highly structured analytical framework. I spend my 80% writing architectural prompts that firmly force the system to thoroughly analyze the precise historical context, the underlying socioeconomic background, and the distinct subtle cultural nuances of the text. I define strict rules that violently prevent the analysis from becoming a generic, shallow high school book report. The logic must absolutely mandate a deep, respectful dive into the character's core motivations and the overarching cultural significance of the reading initiative. Whether I am actively answering rigorous competition questions regarding community reading inspiration or systematically drafting large-scale community-wide initiatives, the structural logic absolutely ensures that the final output resonates with genuine emotional depth rather than sounding like a cold machine-generated cliché. I spend hours upon hours explicitly defining the exact tone, the required level of human empathy, and the specific cultural touchstones that must be deeply respected and highlighted. When the foundational logic is built perfectly, the resulting literary analysis or cultural proposal is breathtakingly authentic and incredibly moving. This logic-building obsession remarkably even extends deeply into highly niche, deeply personal physical systems where complex variables must align perfectly with natural elements. Carefully consider the complex mathematical calculations required when determining precise material alignments for personal accessories based on specific timing and energetic parameters. For instance, if one is systematically calculating the ideal traditional feng shui configurations, perhaps looking deeply into the specific elemental properties of materials like lutong, or determining which precise mineral stones and bracelet configurations mathematically align with highly specific birth information and exact birth timing. This is absolutely not a simple matter of random guessing or mere aesthetic preference. It is an incredibly intricate system of intersecting historical and elemental variables, I gladly spend hours aggressively engineering logic structures that automatically cross-reference specific birth dates, exact birth times, and elemental properties against the known historical and energetic values of various traditional materials. The analytical system must flawlessly securely calculate the complex interactions between the specific temporal birth parameters and the physical properties of the chosen accessories. If the underlying logic fundamentally determining these elemental calculations is even slightly off balance, the entire recommendation is completely compromised and entirely useless. Therefore, I spend 80% of my time relentlessly testing the mathematical and elemental logic constraints, ensuring that every single possible variable combination confidently yields a harmoniously accurate and perfectly aligned result. I am quite literally building a digital logic engine to flawlessly process ancient structural systems. This extensive foundational work brings us seamlessly to the core advanced methodologies that essentially consume absolutely all of my working hours. The specific techniques I heavily utilize are widely known in the technical engineering space as meta-prompting, reverse prompting, and chain-of-thought architecture. Meta-prompting is essentially the incredibly complex process of writing a foundational system that actually actively writes its own highly detailed instructions based entirely on a set of incredibly strict overarching rules that you thoroughly provide. You are essentially meticulously building a master architect that automatically builds other capable architects. Reverse prompting is an entirely different but equally fascinating mechanical beast. It thoroughly involves taking a completely perfect final end result, perhaps a completely flawless visual graphic or a perfectly structured corporate financial summary, analyzing it meticulously backwards and completely extracting its exact structural DNA so you can confidently replicate that absolute perfection every single time on absolute demand. I spend countless hours doing exactly this tedious task. I forensically dissect incredibly successful outcomes to fundamentally understand exactly why they worked so incredibly well. I systematically reverse engineer the perfection so I can permanently build a reliable machine that continuously gracefully produces that exact perfection on command. Chain of thought, as I extensively detailed earlier, is the strict, rigid enforcement of step-by-step logical deduction, actively preventing any system from jumping to rushed, entirely incorrect conclusions. Why do I intentionally, willingly do this to myself every single day? Why do I deliberately put myself through this incredibly tedious, exhausting, and frequently highly frustrating process of intense logic building, instead of just diving right in and lazily doing the work? The traditional chaotic way, like absolutely everybody else in the modern office. The concrete answer heavily comes down to one single, incredibly powerful, highly definitive word: leverage. Leverage is arguably the single most important fundamental concept in the entire sprawling landscape of modern professional work. If I purposely spend 80% of my valuable time, say 4 or 5 solid, uninterrupted hours, a single working day, just intensely structuring the logic, fiercely refining the reverse prompting architectures, and completely thoroughly bulletproofing the overarching system, the actual final execution of the complex task takes mere minutes or sometimes even just a few seconds. When the foundational underlying architecture is utterly flawless, I absolutely do not ever have to go back and painstakingly manually fix 100 little annoying tiny errors. I do not have to aggressively manually adjust the broken data formulas in the massive spreadsheet or endlessly attempt to fix a cartoon character's weird, completely distorted hands in a visually generated image, because the initial mathematical constraints were simply far too loose. I do not have to nervously rapidly rewrite the corporate financial summary an hour before the big meeting, because the system wildly entirely hallucinated a completely incorrect revenue number. I do not have to heavily edit a cultural literature proposal because it originally sounded emotionally hollow and completely inauthentic. The upfront initial cost in personal time and massive mental energy is undeniably incredibly massive, but the back-end sheer efficiency and the absolute pristine quality of the final output are entirely mathematically exponential. We currently sadly possess this deep, somewhat highly toxic obsession in modern corporate work culture with constant visible physical output. If you are not actively sending emails, typing furiously on your loud mechanical keyboard, or sitting visibly in a crowded, boring video meeting, nodding your head vigorously, people naturally instantly assume you are slacking off or simply aggressively avoiding hard work. Middle corporate management absolutely deeply loves to see people constantly moving around frantically. It provides a completely false, comforting sense of constant progress. But the absolute highest maximum return on investment work happens in complete, utter, absolute silence. It actually happens when you are literally staring blankly at a bare wall, thinking incredibly deeply about the core fundamental architecture of a highly complex structural problem. It happens when you are quietly, methodically mapping out the sprawling, interconnected logic tree of an automated system that will eventually definitely save you and your entire team hundreds of hours of painful manual labor down the line. Now, to be completely, totally honest and transparent with you, committing to heavily doing this actually requires a truly ridiculous, almost absurd amount of sheer mental patience. There are deeply dark, highly frustrating days when I aggressively spend 6 solid consecutive hours simply trying to deeply figure out exactly why a specific spatial mathematical parameter in my JSON configuration file is being completely totally ignored by the visual generation system, or exactly why a specific localized data sequence in the corporate financial reporting metric is absolutely vehemently refusing to accurately calculate properly. It is deeply, incredibly, maddeningly frustrating. You will inevitably frequently question your basic life choices on those tough days. You will desperately, frantically wonder why you do not just simply casually do the task manually like every other seemingly normal person in the bustling office. You will strongly, desperately want to completely quit and go straight immediately back to the highly comfortable, incredibly familiar chaos of the 20% reactionary shallow work. But you absolutely must understand that this exact struggle is the harsh, deeply demanding reality of actively doing truly exceptional world-class professional work in the modern digital age. The real actual magic is absolutely definitely not in the highly expensive software tools you endlessly purchase. The true magic is definitely absolutely not in the recurring expensive monthly subscription models or the heavily advertised newest platform software updates. The sheer total magic is entirely completely located securely in the quiet, deeply unglamorous, incredibly boring setup phase. So how can you actually practically begin to actively apply this highly specific, intense philosophy to your own personal life? If you currently actually have a highly demanding, completely normal corporate job, a busy, lively family to actively take care of, or intense, heavy university coursework, constantly demanding your immediate, urgent attention, you obviously practically cannot just suddenly drop absolutely everything you are currently doing and selfishly abruptly disappear into a completely silent, isolated logic cave for 8 solid hours a single day. You have very real, actual responsibilities and highly demanding bosses who constantly expect immediate, rapid-fire answers. You absolutely definitely need to fundamentally start this long process with a completely, utterly ruthless, thorough audit of your personal daily time. I strongly want you to actively spend one entire whole week relentlessly, obsessively tracking exactly where your precious hours and fleeting minutes actually actively go. Write down diligently every single time you completely switch tasks, every single time you quickly answer a completely, totally irrelevant, mundane email, and every single time you actually do something highly, incredibly manual that could easily, definitely be thoroughly systematized or entirely automated. You will highly likely be entirely, thoroughly horrified by the final concrete results. You will clearly, plainly see exactly just how much of your daily mental energy is entirely, completely consumed by highly reactive, completely shallow, entirely meaningless work that moves absolutely nothing genuinely forward in your actual long-term career. Once you finally actually possess your brutal, honest time data, you must immediately aggressively begin the absolute elimination phase. You must start mercilessly, aggressively cutting down the daily ambient noise. You must absolutely, immediately stop willingly volunteering your precious time for random, irrelevant side tasks that fundamentally do not absolutely bring genuine core value to your main, overarching objectives. You must start bravely, confidently saying no to scheduled recurring meetings where your physical presence is merely entirely decorative rather than highly, genuinely functional. Finally, once you have successfully, completely cleared the dead brush, you must fiercely, passionately, and aggressively, highly protect your 80% deep focus time blocks. You must physically, deliberately turn off every single distracting notification on your mobile phone and your primary computer desktop. You should heavily, actively utilize aggressive time-blocking techniques to literally carve out highly, fiercely protected, completely uninterrupted spaces in your daily digital calendar. You must actively, explicitly learn to intensely focus on one single, incredibly foundational architectural task entirely at a time. I strongly, highly recommend you patiently start by actively dedicating just 20% of your daily day to this incredibly core architectural logic work, and slowly, confidently, progressively scale it massively up from there as you inevitably successfully gain more personal time leverage and naturally, gradually free up far more of your incredibly valuable personal time. Spending the vast, overwhelming majority of your daily day deeply, intensely focused on one single, incredibly highly complex, fundamental, foundational thing is truly not glamorous at all. It will never, absolutely ever look genuinely cool or trendy on a highly edited, short, viral social media reel. Most actual days, as I have repeatedly strongly said, it is truly just me sitting quietly, staring intensely at a bright, glowing computer screen, drinking a completely cold, neglected cup of room-temperature tea, trying desperately, frantically to deeply figure out exactly why a highly complex logic system is completely, totally failing to accurately recognize a seemingly incredibly basic, simple command. It is profoundly very quiet. It is highly, incredibly repetitive. It is frequently, completely, deeply isolating. But I strongly, absolutely promise you, it is deeply, profoundly, genuinely peaceful. When you consistently actually operate this exact specific way, you effectively entirely strip away the frantic, deeply underlying constant anxiety of absolutely always secretly feeling like you are terribly falling hopelessly behind your scheduled deadlines. You completely, absolutely stop running frantically around, constantly, aggressively putting out tiny, completely avoidable daily fires, exactly because you actually wisely spent your highly valuable time heavily, completely fireproofing the entire massive structural foundation of the whole entire building. And far more importantly than absolutely anything else, this deep, meticulous methodology absolutely, definitely, firmly works. It consistently, reliably, naturally produces a remarkably high caliber of entirely exceptional professional work that the frantically, constantly, highly stressed, shallow multitaskers can never, absolutely, ever genuinely hope to accurately, mathematically, or creatively match. No matter exactly how many extra unpaid long hours they desperately stay at the highly demanding office. Abraham Lincoln supposedly famously wisely said, Give me exactly 6 full hours to completely chop down a large tree, and I will absolutely definitely heavily spend the first 4 solid hours carefully, meticulously, aggressively sharpening the heavy axe. I basically conceptually genuinely spend 80% of my entire working day actively doing absolutely nothing but aggressively, meticulously, heavily sharpening my incredibly complex digital axe. I carefully, deeply map out the complete entire logic. I strongly, fiercely, accurately define the strict, incredibly rigid boundaries, and I meticulously, powerfully, correctly build the entire massive structural framework. I actively, continuously ensure the metaphorical digital edge is as incredibly, phenomenally sharp, as fundamentally, technically, physically possible, exactly before I absolutely ever foolishly take a single wild, rapid swing at the intended target. The actual physical, literal chopping. The final actual execution. The final, incredibly rapid automated generation of the highly complex visual image. The final, absolutely flawless, accurate calculation of the dense corporate financial data. The final, completely seamless, perfect rendering of the presentation slides, or the final, deeply beautiful, incredibly moving generation of the cultural classic literature proposal. That specific exact thing is strictly by absolute far the absolute easiest, incredibly simple part of the whole entire sprawling technical process. That final actual execution accurately happens literally, cleanly, securely, exactly in the complete blink of an eye. Do not ever foolishly, lazily look for incredibly quick, highly easy, completely fake shortcuts. The highly deceptive people constantly loudly selling you magical digital shortcuts are simply actively trying to rapidly make a quick, incredibly easy financial profit entirely off of your deeply inherent, highly human impatience. True, completely lasting, genuine professional productivity is incredibly painfully slow, highly intensely methodical, and deeply incredibly strictly intentional. You absolutely strictly must effectively fundamentally find the one deep structural, highly foundational core thing that actually genuinely mathematically moves the needle forward in your specific highly chosen profession, and you absolutely firmly, fiercely must willingly, heavily give it the immense, incredibly quiet, totally uninterrupted, deep time it truly, genuinely, fully deserves. I strongly, passionately, fervently urge you to absolutely, immediately stop, frantically, desperately, wildly swinging a incredibly, utterly dull, heavy axe completely all day long, and instead, bravely sit quietly down, deeply, intensely, strictly focus, and powerfully, confidently, carefully begin the incredibly, seemingly boring, but utterly, completely, genuinely beautiful, foundational work of heavily, intentionally, intensely sharpening your mind and your highly structured digital systems.